maybe most of the time, if it's really a call, it's something that's outside of our comfort zone, right? It's calling us to be converted to a whole new way of being. But I think that's not often part of our narrative. I think part of what we need to hear in her story, too, is that this work is the work of communities and groups of people. We don't ever do this alone. We like to tell stories of heroes, and heroes are rugged individualists standing alone, changing the world. And she changed the world, but she didn't do it by standing alone.
Hello and welcome to Can I Get a Witness, the podcast. This podcast is an audio companion to the book, Can I Get a Witness? 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice. I'm Shay Tuttle. In each episode of this podcast, I'll talk with one of our authors about the person they profiled for the book and about their writing process. Today I'm speaking with Therese Lysaught. Therese Lysaught is professor of Catholic moral theology and healthcare ethics at the Neiswanger Institute of Bioethics and Healthcare Leadership, Loyola University Chicago's Stritch School of Medicine, and the Institute of Pastoral Studies at Loyola University Chicago. She is the co-editor of On Moral Medicine, Theological Perspectives on Medical Ethics, 3rd edition, published by Eerdmans in 2012, and of Catholic Bioethics and Social Justice, published by Liturgical Press in 2018. For our book, Therese wrote on Mary Stella Simpson. I am so excited to talk to you because I think every time I go back to your chapter, I'm really excited about, and I'm excited about all the chapters, but I think there's something about Sister Mary Stella. I feel like nobody knows who she is,
right.
And I feel like we get to kind of introduce her to the world, and that makes me really excited. So for people who might not be familiar with her, can you start out by giving a kind of summary of her significance?
Sure. So Sister Mary Stella Simpson is both a person in her own right, but she also represents a group of, what are we calling our folks? Activists, witnesses. What's the subtitle of the book?
Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators.
There you go. She represents a group of peacemakers, community builders, and agitators for faith and justice that a lot of people don't know about. And that would be Catholic women religious, sisters, nuns. People use different phrases to refer to them. But throughout the 20th century, especially in the United States, women religious did enormous work on the ground, often unsung, in the poorest communities in the United States, working with the poor, for social justice, for racial justice, helping care for the sick, for the most marginalized people in our communities. And often people don't know about them. So on the one hand, she represents this entire group of people who were doing this work. But she's also a really interesting person in her own right, insofar as she was born a Baptist in the middle of the Midwest, hadn't actually met Catholics until she was, I think, 18 or 19. And she was so entranced by, she went to nursing school and first encountered Catholic sisters who were doing the work they'd always been doing, running hospitals and Catholic health centers. And she was so entranced with the work that these women were doing, not paid, charitable work, living in community, working hard, leading organizations, having a lot of independence and authority, at least for the time. But she was amazed sort of by the grace of their work, by their relationships with their patients and the difference that they were making. And over a series of years working with these women in Catholic healthcare, she decided to become a nun, which, for a good Baptist girl, that's kind of a shocking thing to do. And it gave her mother a heart attack. So part of her story is interesting, her relationship with her mother as she makes this journey in faith, joins this religious order. She works in Catholic healthcare for a number of years, and she is just top-notch nurse administrator. She's moving through Catholic hospitals. She's cleaning up the act in all these hospitals because, it's the middle part of the 20th century, and hospitals are emerging, and people are learning how to do things like, hygiene in hospitals and make processes more efficient. She works in OBGYN. And at a pretty late point in her career, maybe 20 years, she'd been working for 20 years or so, her order decides to send her for a little more training as a nurse midwife. And they pack her off to the southwest of the United States. And at first, she's just a little, she takes a little umbrage that, she's excellent. She's at the top of her game. How could she possibly need more training? And she goes for 6 months out to New Mexico, and her life is transformed. She encounters a whole new way of doing OBGYN, of delivering babies, of interfacing with families. She learns about home visits. She, out in kind of the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, she begins to visit women in their homes prior, for prenatal care and then for delivery. And watching babies be born in those contexts does a couple things for her. One, she really comes to understand, what we now call the social determinants of health, and how all these other factors that affect where people live, their housing, their education, their food, their lack of water. She starts to understand how those are also part of caring for people who are sick. Those need to be attended to. But she also begins to understand family relationships in a different way, in a way that she had never been able to see in the hospital. So she returns from her year in the desert, we could call it, and she goes back to being a Catholic hospital nurse administrator. And she in the United States, she introduces for the first time this huge innovation in labor and delivery. Namely, she pushes for fathers to be present in the delivery room with their wives while they're having their baby. I mean, now we think of that as like, hasn't it always been that way?
Right.
But she was the one who started it, right? This nun, this obscure person nobody's ever heard of, right? So she becomes hugely evangelical for what she calls family-centered care, transforming how mothers, fathers, families welcome new life into the world. And then she goes trotting around the United States, be an evangelical, trying to, convince everybody to do this. And people sign on. I mean, she doesn't meet actually too much resistance, but it was a sea change in how we think about and practice labor and delivery in the United States. And this came out of her experience with these poor, mostly Hispanic families in New Mexico. So it's a great story, and that all happens prior to the time that she goes to Mound Bayou, Mississippi in 1967.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. There's so much to her, and a bunch of those things I want to return to as we talk too. But I'd like to ask about your framing of your chapter. You frame your chapter with a story from the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. Can you share, and just in your own words, that story, and then talk a little bit about how you see Sister Mary Stella fitting into that narrative?
So there's a couple pieces to this. So first of all, what's the story? So the book of Exodus is primarily about the liberation of the people of Israel from the oppression in Egypt. The Israelites had been living in Egypt for 400 years or so, and over time, they had become a minority class and had been subjected to harsher and harsher and harsher regimes of socioeconomic oppression and exclusion. And it was really a bad situation. They were crying out to the Lord for salvation. And in the Bible, God works in very strange ways. If I was running the world, I would never do things the way God does. But it's God's story, not mine. So in Exodus, the way God decides to free the people of Israel from the oppression, particularly of Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, is to send Moses, right? So Exodus is about the story of Moses. But first Moses has to be born. God is very slow. God, it takes generally 30 or 40 years for, these salvific types of actions to happen. But Pharaoh is concerned because these Israelites, they're just reproducing like nobody's business, and soon they're going to outnumber the Egyptians, right? So Pharaoh decides that he's going to puts out a policy that he's going to kill all the firstborn boys, or I'm sorry, all the baby boys that are born to the Israelite women, as a way of both continuing oppression and reducing the population. But, so the story opens with Pharaoh deciding to do this. But at the time, babies were born with midwives. And the Israelite midwives really weren't going to have any part of this, right? So the story opens with these two midwives, Shipra and Puah, who confront Pharaoh. Pharaoh wants to say, "Why are all these boys being born?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm just so sorry, Pharaoh. Those Israelite women, they just have those babies before we can get there. There's nothing we can do about it." Right? So you have this story up front where you see this resistance being put forward by these midwives over against male oppression, economic oppression, the oppression of this people. And because of this sort of political resistance, Moses is born and gets hidden away, right? And then gets adopted into the Egyptian family. And over time, he becomes the person who then leads, that God uses to lead the Egyptians to liberation. Now, this story of Exodus has been enormously important for oppressed peoples around the world. More recently, Latin American, Central American people through liberation theology. But prior to that, it was a very important story for enslaved Africans and African Americans in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries in America. This story of an enslaved people oppressed by the regime, that God was going to come and liberate them. So this story infuses African American literature, African American spirituals, African American consciousness, and it starts with midwives.
Mm-hmm. So you write about Mary's childhood, and you talk about her growing up fairly poor, and also quite happy. You refer to her as a Baptist deep within the Bible Belt. And of course, when she tells her mother she wants to be a nurse, her mother disapproves. When she's interested in Catholicism, her mother disapproves. And then, of course, also deciding to take up religious orders, her mother disapproves. But somehow, Mary ends up doing all of these things, and somehow in the process winning over her mother. And I think we'll talk more about Mound Bayou later, but I think some of those same kind of characteristics of this tenacity and optimism and eventually sort of winning these different kinds of victories in her lives. Like, this is a pattern for her. How do you think she was shaped into that kind of a person? How is it that she was someone who could be sort of tough and also optimistic in the face of long odds and make it work and make it happen?
I think part of it has to be her personality. She was just born that way. She was also the only daughter in a family of, I think she had like 8 brothers or something, so that's going to give you an edge. Yeah, she talks about her childhood, as this sort of hard scrabble sort of existence. But as you said, very happy. And I think it probably, imbued in her a certain sense of tenacity and independence and, resilience. I think one of the things that was, interesting to me about those moments in her story that you mentioned, and a lot of these folks in this book, and you could include so many more stories in a book like this, they have key moments of conversion, and usually these moments of conversion result in conflicts with their families or their previous identities. So that seemed to me, again, a characteristic of her life is that she has all these conversions along the way. One to becoming a nurse, standing in the face of social disapproval from her mother, and then to become a Catholic, in the middle of the 20th century in a Protestant space. Boy, that's just really not done. And then to become a nun, oh my.
Mm-hmm.
She also clearly also had other family members around her who supported her in her vocation and her vision and her sense of self, and, gave her, the sort of advice you get in families don't worry, we'll take care of your mother. So it wasn't, a lot of these people, we tell these stories as if they're a hero, a pioneer, standing alone. Most of them are surrounded by communities of people who, of course, help them out. I think she also, the way she speaks of herself, she's very down to earth, and she has this sense of vision and vocation and who she is. And, she just has patience, and she's just going to stick it out. And she knows she has this kind of confidence that it'll work out. It'll be fine. I just have to sort of wait it out. And, I don't think it was all easy, but she sort of has this sense of conviction that she's doing the right thing and she's got the right goal in mind. And then she's surrounded by people who help her out.
Yeah. So why Catholicism, and why then become a sister? What do you think drew her to this faith and to this expression of faith?
Yeah, the way she tells it, she hadn't encountered Catholicism prior to going to nursing school and getting into beginning to practice nursing. And at first, she just thought it was really strange. And it was kind of annoying because, she was in this, at the time, nursing schools were kind of boarding schools. You lived there. And so she was living in this sort of Catholic hospital nursing school thing and was surrounded by Catholic practices. The nuns getting up early in the morning and, singing the liturgy at the hours, and it interrupted her sleep, which she didn't really appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, she became intrigued by it. I think she first became intrigued because of the witness she saw from the sisters who were nuns. Their dedication to their patients, the way they cared for their patients, the sort of grace that filled them and their interactions with their patients. That was really interesting to her. So over time, she began to see the community getting up to sing prayers in the morning as a beautiful thing, right? She began to see it wasn't just waking her up. It was like really lovely, right? And it attracted her. And things like holy water and blessing their hands and connecting. She did this really funny little prank experiment. I don't know what you want to call it. So in this nursing school, there was a holy water font, right? And, she's a Baptist. She's like, I don't know, holy water, what is that? Some Catholic magical thing. And so, and she would see the nuns, dip their hands in the water and, cross themselves and whatnot. And she was, she's an empiricist. She was like, does that holy water really, is it holy? Does it really do anything? Like, what is that all about? So one night she went around and she changed and she put just regular water in the holy water fountains. And she's like, I want to see if they notice. I want to see if there's any difference, I was like, oh, this is a great story. So she did this, right? And, the nuns didn't notice. They just kept doing their thing with what they thought was holy water. And she asked him, one of the nuns later, she's like, well, okay, I confess, I changed the holy water. It's not holy. It's just regular water. Did you, talk to me about this? And, the nun sort of laughed and said, well, I really think that one of the thing that makes our hands holy is the care we give to these women. And we bring that holiness to the holy water, and then the water brings it back to the women, right? So she kind of connected it to the work. And that story for Sister Mary Stella, I think, was really important, right? Because it wasn't just some weird magical thing. It was connected to all the work they were doing. And she began to see how grace worked in this really thickly disseminated way, how it was interwoven through everything they did. And I think for her, it just attracted her. I think one last thing I might add too is, folks have this notion that being a nun, being a sister is a very limiting sort of thing, right? It really constrains you. It, puts these brackets on your life. But at that time, and maybe even still, for many women, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it was a way for them to be very independent, right? This was a way for women to get an education, to get into leadership positions in places like hospitals where they would not otherwise be able to get into leadership positions, to be able to move around the country. So there's a certain kind of freedom and independence in it that people often don't see. And I think that was attractive to her too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to make sense with her personality as it comes through on the page. So You alluded to some of the story, but I do want to ask a little bit about Santa Fe. So, Sister Mary Stella had been working as a nurse for 18 years. She's at the top of her game, well respected. And then her community sends her to Santa Fe, 1957. What happened in Santa Fe?
Well, more conversion, God, you might say a whole bunch of things. And that's another piece of, I don't think I wove this in as well as I possibly could into the narrative of bringing in the kind of the biblical narrative into her story. But, anyone who's read scripture knows that, if you want change, you go to the desert, and you might spend 40 days or you might spend,
40 years.
40 years,
yeah.
But you go to the desert and you have this conversion experience.
Mm-hmm.
So she goes to the desert and she gets down there and she's immediately immersed in a completely different approach to pregnant women and women who are delivering their babies. She had been coming from a hospital environment, and hospital environments, even to this day, are very military, right? They're very hierarchical. They're very constrained. There's lots of rules. And who's not in charge? The patient. If you've ever been to a hospital, you know that when you walk in, it's a scary place. There's all kinds of places you're not supposed to go. There's all kinds of, thou shalt not enter signs. There's people who are clearly have authority and expertise and you don't, right? Even today, that's the message we get from hospitals. And it certainly was the case then. And she was part of the power regime. She was the one making the rules. She was the one wearing the white coat or the habit, she was the one making sure the patients followed the rules. And, the rules were very strict about who could visit when and, who was allowed in what room and all of this stuff. So, that's the world she had practiced in for 18 years or so. And then she goes to Santa Fe. And, almost from the outset, the women who are running the Catholic Maternity Institute, which was the midwife school, almost immediately they send out the students 2 by 2, again, so scriptural, to visit women in their homes. And this experience, for some reason, just shocked her, right? So she, had to go to these people's houses. She had to knock on the door. She had to wait for them to invite her in, right? She, as a nurse, had to ask permission of these women to, do stuff in their house. The mothers were the ones in charge in their homes. The mothers were offering her hospitality. And, one of the phrases she uses, she's like, so in Santa Fe, she says, you talk about an eye opener. I almost had to have treatment for shock. I mean, this just rocked her world. Because in the hospital, you never ask patients for permission. You walk in, you tell them the way it is, whether they like it or not. We're going to wake you up every 2 hours, whether you need it or not. Right? So this just completely inverted everything that she had thought was true, everything she had done. And actually, she felt like, she had this kind of crisis of identity. Like, what had she been doing for 20 years? She'd been treating these women all wrong. Right. So part of her year was, coming to grips with this, what she had done before. It wasn't bad. Right. But she had the sense that it wasn't right. Right. And she was going to go out and she was going to change how everybody else did it, because now she understood that the previous regime was just not right, wasn't good for the patient, wasn't good for mothers and babies, wasn't good for families, wasn't good for healthcare. So it's a great story. And I think, and it shows, you have these two pieces of her. One, so she has this resilience, this stick-to-itiveness, this goal-orientedness, right? She's not going to be held back from her vision, but she's also open to change, right? And she's not afraid. She's not like bullheaded. And I think that's part of the beauty of her story, is this process of discernment, which goes along with also having a strong sense of vocation. These things are connected.
So then, following her time in Santa Fe, your chapter says she worked for nearly 10 years, kind of, as you referred to before, implementing this family-centered maternity care, hospitals all over the country, and, completely transforms maternal infant care in the United States. And then at about age 57, she goes to Mound Bayou. And I'd love for you to take us there by reading that first excerpt from your chapter, if you have that.
Sure. On Monday, November 27, 1967, Sister Mary Stella Simpson wrote a letter to her sisters back home at her community in Evansville, Indiana. She wrote from Mound Bayou, Mississippi, where generations of African Americans had often sung of the connections between their lives and those of the ancient Israelites. She wrote, "Today was my first day for a home visit. I go on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday if possible. We see all new obstetric patients in the home. This affords an opportunity to discover anyone else who lives in the home and needs health care. I started out with my guide and made 5 visits. On the very first one, I had to come back to town to get milk for a baby. He had finished his last bottle. It has gotten really cold, and the 14 people in that family all congregate in one room around a small wood-burning stove. I had to go through a front door, which was like a deep freeze. The floor was slick with ice where water had been tracked in and then froze. The children were all barefoot. Therefore, they couldn't go to school. The parents have no way of getting shoes for them since they have no income." On this particular evening, Sister Mary Stella Simpson had been in Mound Bayou for a week. She had been called to help launch one of the most innovative experiments in healthcare for the poor in U.S. history, the Tufts Delta Health Center. Here, in 1967, this nurse midwife, who had previously pioneered radical changes in obstetrics care across the United States, turned to face the Pharaoh of the Jim Crow South. The cruel oppression of slavery, at least in its most visible form, was a century behind the African American people of Mississippi. A few decades earlier, a group of ex-slaves founded Mound Bayou, a nascent promised land that initially flourished economically, politically, and culturally. Yet the effects of the racialized politics, economics, and medicine of the mid-20th century had exceeded even Pharaoh's vision. When Sister Mary Stella arrived, 59% of all the babies born in Bolivar County, Mississippi, were dying every year, girls and boys alike. But as the story of Shipra and Puah attests, God works grace through those who defy the pharaohs of the world. The Israelites multiplied and grew very numerous. And Sister Mary Stella, in her 6 years in Mound Bayou, never lost a baby.
Thank you. So you write about some of the quiet and the not so quiet ways that Sister Mary Stella fought the Pharaoh of the Jim Crow South. Can you tell one or two of those stories?
Sure. One story she tells, she goes to a house and there's these kids who are 11, 12, and 13 who had never been to school because they didn't have a birth certificate, right? So she just marches off to the principal of the elementary school and says, these children should be in school. And he's real nice and, he's like, oh, blah, 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 policy, blah, blah, I didn't make it up, blah, 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 right? But she persuades him that maybe this is a bad idea and that they should enroll these people, So, she has a couple stories like that. She hears this story about another patient. She goes to this patient's home and the woman is waiting for, I forget what kind of check. I don't know if it was some sort of like food stamps check or she's waiting for some money and she needs the money to, buy food and buy stuff for her kids. And the woman tells her, well, the postwoman at the post office has this practice of she just sort of holds on to the checks of African Americans and just doesn't really let them go. And of course, Sister Mary Stella is like, what? So, she goes and investigates and, makes some contacts and, calls a few people. And a month later, she writes back to her community and she says, remember that postmistress we reported for holding back welfare checks from Black people? She is now enjoying retirement.
Nice.
And then finally, so these are just these little, they seem little, but these constant barriers that her families were running into all the time. So she takes these on over 6 years, one by one by one. Then she encounters Jim Crow segregation in medical care. And that just really frosts every last cookie she has. They have segregated waiting rooms, they have segregated entrances, blacks only, whites only, signs hanging above, nurseries for black babies, nurseries for white babies. And, she says, I thought, no, I haven't lived long enough to see this. So she takes this on, and sometimes she's really direct, she calls government offices, other times she's a little more indirect. There was a local clinic that, had segregated signs, white entrance, black entrance signs. And she goes to the doctor and says, you got to get rid of these signs. And he's like, hey, it's not my clinic. I just work here, gives the sort of passive aggressive sort of response. So, she gives him a hard time. So the next time she goes, she just takes the signs down and takes them home. And so, next time she goes back, she runs into this doctor again, and on purpose, she goes to see him, and he just laughs and he laughs and he laughs. And the signs never went back up. Right. So in her time there, she really kept pressing against all of these little concrete instantiations of Jim Crow. And this is, in 1970, right? This is now post civil rights, but it's still going on.
Right. How do you think Sister Mary Stella is a witness that we need today?
On the one hand, she does her work. She just does her work. She does it excellently. But she's a little known person, right? I mean, a lot of times people think, I'm going to go change the world, right? And they want to make a difference. They want to make a difference immediately. And they want to be known, right? But she just did her thing. And we don't have a sense that just doing excellent work as a form of discipleship is a worthy goal in and of itself. That's the end. So I think she was not, in her little sphere, she was sort of high profile. Among nurse midwives, people knew who she was. But on a bigger stage, she was not well known. And that's the kind of discipleship most of us are called to, because, we're not going to be the Dalai Lama or whatever. Her openness to conversion, to having her preconceived notions of how to do her vocation, that's a lesson that we all need to learn and hear, because God calls us outside our comfort zone. I mean, if you read the scriptures, the people God calls, they're usually called outside their comfort zone. We could just go back to Moses, for example, right? So God calls Moses, and Moses is like, you got the wrong person. Right? Let me give you the 10 reasons I am not the right person for this job. I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do the other thing. And God says, good, right, yeah, you're the one. And, there's story after story after story like that. So, maybe most of the time, if it's really a call, it's something that's outside of our comfort zone, right? It's calling us to be converted to a whole new way of being. But I think that's not often part of our narrative. I think part of what we need to hear in her story, too, is that this work is the work of communities and groups of people. We don't ever do this alone. We like to tell stories of heroes, and heroes are rugged individualists standing alone, changing the world. And she changed the world, but she didn't do it by standing alone. And I think, just one of the things I love reading in her story is her constant sense. This is, before she goes to Santa Fe and before she goes to Mound Bayou, she is energized by the time she spends with poor women in poor communities. She learns a lot. She gains a lot. She loves those relationships. She finds grace there. It's not this unidirectional sense of service. I'm going to take care of these people. She has this very thick sense that, because she enters into relationship with them, and part of it's how she does it, right? She meets them literally where they are, in their houses. And by doing that, she begins to see the texture of their whole life, its positives and its negatives. She enters into relationship with them. She builds relationship with them. And she just she gets so much joy from that. And that sustains her work. I think that's something that is a message we need to hear.
Yeah. How do you think you've been changed by spending so much time with Sister Mary Stella?
Mostly that latter point, right? Trying to figure out, how do I change my social location so that I can do that? That, is a challenge for us because a lot of us don't have the freedom, independence, autonomy that a nun has to just up and go, move to the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. So, I feel like there's some call there that I need to figure out how to wrestle with. I could use a year in the desert. I don't know that I'm going to get that, but that would, probably be helpful.
Yeah. 40 days?
I would take 40 days. 40 days would be nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's been just a really different kind of project for a person like me. Partly, you've given me this opportunity to spend like 2 years with this person. I feel like I know her, and I just haven't really entered into the story of a particular person in that way before. In order to sort of tell it to the world, witness it to the world. But it's just been a great process to do that. It's just been really wonderful to get to know her, and I feel like she's just like I know her, like she's a friend of mine now. And I even went to Mound Bayou. Like this was transformative for me. I had never been to Mississippi, so going to Mississippi and walking around where she was, looking at it as it is today, yeah, that was a very powerful experience for me.
Yeah. So I'd like to close by having you read the excerpt about miracles, which I love. That would be great.
This comes at the end of the chapter. Sister Mary Stella loved the people of Mound Bayou, loved the work, and certainly loved bringing joy, grace, and a little bit of God's righteous justice every so often. My only regret, she said later, is that I didn't stay young long enough to do it forever. I was happy to go to Mound Bayou because it was such a challenge. It was marvelous. I learned more about pediatrics there than I ever learned in school. But most of all, I learned about faith. I never had to spread the gospel to the people there. In spite of all their hardships, their faith in God was unshakable. I think God was with me all the way because I didn't really have to sit down and think about what to do next. In her 6 years with the Tufts Delta Health Center, she never lost a baby or a mother. Nor did she during her year in El Carmen, Texas. These outcomes are nothing short of astonishing, seeming to defy the laws of biology or poverty or reality. How could one woman with her team make such a difference? We hear stories of astounding healings in Scripture or in the stories of the saints, healings that are referred to as miracles. Generally, we enlightened modern readers dismiss such stories as exaggerations, myths, or hagiography. But in the case of Sister Mary Stella, we know that the story is true. Does the fact that we might know the mechanism, these dedicated women seeking out the poor in their homes, being present with them as persons with dignity, connecting them with health care and attending to the social determinants of health, do these factors make it any less of a miracle? Or is this how grace actually works in the world?
Therese, thank you so much. It's been so much fun to talk with you and hear about Sister Mary Stella, and I can't wait to share it with the world.
Me too. So it's been so great to talk with you again.
Can I Get a Witness? The podcast is a production of the Project on Lived Theology at the University of Virginia, a research initiative whose mission is to study the social consequences of theological ideas for the sake of a more just and compassionate world. To learn more about Lived Theology, visit livedtheology.org or find us on social media. This podcast is produced, edited, and engineered by Jessica Seibert, and written, edited, and hosted by me, Shay Tuttle. Original music is by Drew Wilson. Special thanks to project director Charles Marsh. The book, Can I Get a Witness? 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice, is edited by Charles Marsh, Shay Tuttle, and Daniel P. Rhodes. It's published by Eerdmans Publishing Company and is available now. Thank you for listening to Can I Get a Witness, the podcast.